And that came a little later too, which honestly makes sense because life hit them fast. Ringo Starr never stepped into the Beatles as some long-lost brother. He walked in as the replacement, the guy outsiders treated like a spare part. He kept smiling under the hot stage lights while headlines clowned him as the luckiest drummer alive, and industry insiders whispered that he didn't truly belong. Even inside the band, one member acted like Ringo was just hired help, and a sharp-minded outsider twisted their brotherhood into straight-up betrayal. Now, after decades of keeping quiet, Ringo has finally revealed the names he could never forgive, and the list is wild. The past that pushed the Beatles to look down on Ringo hits way deeper than Abbey Road. It started long before fame, money, or screaming crowds ever entered his life. Ringo's anger was born in a hospital bed in wartime Liverpool. Richard Starkey spent more days staring at ceilings than blackboards, first fighting peritonitis, then battling tuberculosis. Those illnesses stole years from him, years that other kids spent learning, growing, and figuring out who they were. When he finally walked out of the hospital, he came out quiet, shy, and carrying this heavy feeling that everyone around him knew more than he did. That insecurity followed him all the way into the biggest band on earth, making him feel like the one with the shortest resume, even when he was holding everything together behind the kit. The drums became his escape, his shield, his whole identity in local groups like Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He wasn't flashy, but he was solid, rock steady, unshakable, the kind of drummer bands dream about. So in 1962, when the Beatles realized they needed someone stronger than Pete Best, they called Ringo. He walked into EMI as the upgrade, the man meant to lift the band to the next level. But within days, he got hit with one of the biggest humiliations of his career. At the Love Me Do session, producer George Martin brought in session drummer Andy White because he didn't trust the new guy yet. And decades later, Ringo admitted that the sting of that move never faded. He once said, "I went through hell personally because George Martin had this Andy White session drummer. I made him apologize every day." Imagine that. He joins as the supposed savior, the missing piece, and the grown-ups in the room quietly replace him on the band's first major single. That cut deep. The press didn't make it any easier. Headlines joked that he could only keep time, like he was some beginner behind a school drum kit. Critics called him the least talented Beatle, saying he was only lucky to stand behind Lennon and McCartney. Your first big hit drops and the story becomes that you're only there because your friends vouched for you. Talk about disrespect. Inside the band, the hierarchy was loud and clear. John and Paul wrote nonstop. George pushed like a frustrated genius waiting for his moment. And Ringo, well, they put him in the corner. He did the novelty songs, played the steady beats, cracked jokes, and kept the vibe light, like he was the guy just meant to keep things calm, instead of being treated as a real equal. When Brian Epstein passed in 1967, and the band lost the one person who kept them steady, that quiet, easygoing drummer suddenly found himself squeezed between three massive egos, and one of them, more than anyone else, made him feel small every single day. Paul McCartney, the non-stop grinder who worked like he had something to prove, ended up pushing Ringo right out of his own group. If there was one Beatle who really stretched Ringo's patience to the limit, it was Paul. After Epstein was gone, Paul slid straight into that empty leadership seat like it was waiting for him. He wrote non-stop, organized every session, and dragged the others back into the studio whenever they drifted. Ringo summed it up in the most honest way possible. Paul always made the phone call. Paul would want us to work all the time because he's the workaholic. And that line still hits hard. It might sound admirable from the outside, but on the inside it felt like control. Paul wasn't just writing songs, he was telling everyone how to play them. Things reached the breaking point during the White Album sessions in 1968. Paul got obsessed with tiny details, making Ringo redo a simple drum pattern again and again like he was a beginner. Then, Paul took it even further. He sat down at the kit and showed him how it should be played, right in front of everyone. For a drummer who had already been replaced once on Love Me Do, this wasn't just a correction, it was a harsh reminder that he was optional. That moment snapped something in Ringo. He packed up, walked out, and vanished for almost 2 weeks while the others were left scrambling. Years later, he still talked about how painful it was to be treated like a piece of equipment instead of a partner. Because seriously, if Paul didn't trust his drumming, what was he even doing there? Paul's perfectionism did keep the Beatles sounding sharp, but it also made the others feel like session players on their own records. For Ringo, who already carried the weight of being the replacement and the least talented, watching Paul literally take his seat was like his worst fear playing out in real time. And here's where things get twisted in a way no one saw coming. These two men, after all the fights, all the pride, all the ego, ended up becoming each other's last real link to the Beatles. In 2015, Paul stood on stage at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and personally inducted Ringo as a solo legend. He even joked about inducting him into the hall, and the crowd loved it. In the years since, they've toured together, shared stages, and Paul has even called their bond very special. But underneath all that history sits one name that changed everything: John Lennon. The moment Ringo realized his leader was slipping away, the whole band felt different. Nothing shook Ringo more than watching John slowly drift into someone he barely recognized. For years, John had been the anchor, the guy Ringo admired no matter how wild the arguments got. And losing that felt like losing the core of the group. Ringo had always stood right behind John's shoulder like a calm shadow, loyal and steady. But in 1968, something shifted, first quiet, then loud enough to shake the whole band. Yoko Ono didn't just show up next to John. She walked straight into the studio, into the creative decisions, into every conversation, and eventually into the unspoken ranking of the group. The Beatles had always worked like a tight circle, 4 voices, 4 minds, but suddenly there were 5 presences in the room, and only one seemed to hold all the weight. Session after session, the energy grew stranger. During experimental tracks, Yoko would jump in with ideas about tone or rhythm, and Ringo wasn't shocked by her confidence. He was shocked by John's reaction. Instead of checking her or protecting the group's balance, John backed her instantly. One day, he looked straight at Ringo and said, "Just keep it," with no softness at all. That one moment hit Ringo hard, especially as someone who already carried the reputation of being the least talented. It felt like the message was, "Your opinion ends where hers begins." Tension snapped tighter every time someone questioned Yoko's presence. George Harrison once hit his breaking point, raised his voice, and suddenly John exploded, slamming the table and accusing the whole band of disrespect. At that moment, it wasn't about music anymore. It was about loyalty, and John had clearly moved his allegiance. For Ringo, who always valued peace and steady energy, the emotional weight was crushing. In his eyes, the Beatles were losing the leader who once held them together because he was locked in an all-consuming relationship that left no space for anybody else. Years later, Ringo openly admitted the band was already drifting apart by then, and he shared one memory that still hits the heart. He described visiting John in New York in 1980. The laughter, the comfort, the feeling that they were still brothers no matter how messy things had gotten. Only weeks later, John was assassinated, and all the tension between them disappeared without a chance to fix anything. Their issues didn't get solved. They got erased before they could even face them. Then came Alan Klein, the outsider who quietly turned the Beatles against each other. At first, his arrival didn't feel dramatic at all. It felt like a breath of relief. With Brian Epstein gone and Apple Corps losing money like a broken faucet, the Beatles were drowning in business problems. They were global icons who couldn't manage their own accounts. Ringo, fed up with polished executives who talked fancy but delivered nothing, found Klein refreshing, sharp, bold, and ready to fight for them. John jumped on board first, George followed, and Ringo, desperate for stability, joined them too. He later explained what hooked him. Klein was a hustler, and as Ringo put it, "I felt it was time I had someone hustling for me." But behind that tough charm was a strategist who knew exactly how to weaponize loyalty, turning friendships into fractures one move at a time. Alan Klein didn't walk into the Beatles' world blind. He studied every crack in that group like a master schemer. He saw Paul's need to run the ship, John's restless energy, George's simmering frustration, and Ringo's craving for peace, then used all of it to tighten his grip. Meetings that used to be loud arguments turned into straight-up battlegrounds. Decisions that once came from 4 equal voices turned into 3 against 1. And within months, Klein had turned tension into a full-blown fracture that nobody could pretend away. Paul refused to sign a contract with him, but Klein pushed John, George, and Ringo to keep moving without him. Before long, Paul sued the 3 of them, and Klein, in 1970. That lawsuit wasn't just business. It blew up whatever friendship they still had left. Every bruise between them deepened, turning trust into dust, and the brotherhood that once felt unbreakable snapped under lawyers, paperwork, and cold courtroom air. Then came the cruel twist Ringo never saw coming. By 1973, he realized the man he trusted had mishandled money, twisted contracts, and played the Beatles like pieces in a game he intended to win. Klein was fired, investigations followed, and the 3 who had stood beside him, including Ringo, ended up admitting they had been wrong. That's when Alan Steckler dropped a heartbreaking truth. He revealed George once said, "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there. I'm ready, so is Ringo." That line exposes everything. For Ringo, Klein became the deepest betrayal. The man he thought would protect them turned out to be the man who made sure they would never share a stage again. And that leads to the real question people kept throwing at Ringo for decades. Was he actually the least talented Beatle? Or had everyone underestimated him because he wasn't loud or flashy? By the time Klein's chaos faded, Ringo was left staring at a reputation built on jokes that never matched the truth. For years he heard it. The lucky drummer, the guy Lennon and McCartney supposedly carried. After the breakup, those words hit even harder because he no longer had the band standing behind him. But time exposed the real story. The same sessions where Paul took his drum seat and John dismissed his ideas were also the sessions where producers noticed something the critics never bothered to look at. Ringo was the only Beatle who almost never drifted off tempo. He was steady, unshakable, consistent without forcing it. George Martin, who once replaced him on Love Me Do, later admitted Ringo wasn't just dependable, he was the click track, the human anchor keeping the band glued together. Younger drummers tried to copy his grooves and realized they couldn't match his feel, the swing, the pocket, the natural timing only he had. As the years passed, the story flipped completely. His solo career delivered real hits, and legends like George Harrison, Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, and Elton John kept calling him, not for nostalgia, but because his groove lifted their music in ways only he could deliver. Even Paul, the same guy who once took his drum seat and corrected his patterns, ended up standing under the bright lights and inducting him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. life really came full circle. Today, Ringo's legacy isn't about luck or simplicity at all. It's about precision, instinct, and pure endurance. He wasn't the least talented Beatle. He was the heartbeat, the steady foundation that let the other three fly as high as they did. And the longer time passes, the clearer that truth hits. Ringo Starr was never the weak link. He was the piece nobody appreciated until decades later, when the music world realized no one could replace his feel. He didn't shout for attention. He didn't fight for headlines. He just delivered exactly what every song needed, every single time. Half a century later, the receipts speak louder than any critic ever could. So now that you've seen the full picture, who do you think Ringo held the deepest resentment for in his heart? Paul, John, or Alan Klein? Drop it in the comments and tell me which part of this story stunned you the most and why. And if you want more brutally honest, behind-the-curtain stories about the legends you thought you knew, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Secret America. Trust me, there are plenty more secrets hiding behind those famous smiles.